Welcome to The Free Will Show, a podcast that provides a beginner-friendly introduction to free will while also exploring cutting-edge developments on the topic. I'm Taylor Sear.
And I'm Matt Flummer. In this episode, we talk with Saul Smilansky about his view of free will called Illusionism and philosophical issues related to overpunishment.
Thanks for listening. Well, I'm happy to introduce Saul Smilansky, professor at the Department of Philosophy of the University of Haifa, Israel, and currently based at Oxford University. Saul writes on several issues in normative ethics and value theory. He's written several articles and a book on the free will problem. His book, Free Will and Illusion, which was published in 2000 by Oxford University Press, is one that we'll talk a little bit about today. But we also want to ask Saul about some of his recent work on issues related to the law, especially an article titled Overpunishment and the Punishment of the Innocent, which came out in Analytic Philosophy in 2021. And we're excited to dig into that today in our conversation. Thanks for joining us, Saul. Could you start by telling us a bit about yourself, your work, how you came to be interested in working on issues related to free will?
Sure. I became interested in philosophy when I was 15 and a half or something like that, just reading an intro book. And very quickly, I sort of fell in love with the free will problem. So I started thinking about it at some stage very, very early. So I've probably been thinking about it too many years, but and I think it's sort of easy to explain why one would fall in love with this problem, because it really is one of the big classic problems of philosophy. It's like, one of these huge whales that you're trying to catch it by its tail, but also some problems are really important theoretically, and some maybe don't have that much of a theoretical interest, but they're important practically. And free will is clearly, I think, both. I mean, it's really a huge theoretical conundrum, and which matters to a lot of theoretical issues, but it also really matters to both people's personal lives and to the way we order society. I mean, we'll get to that once we think about punishment, but we can't think about punishment without thinking about free will. So it's just like, I think, an overdetermination, partly because it's such a huge problem, and partly because it really matters.
Yeah,
right.
That makes
absolutely.
sense. Yeah.
Before we turn to the issue of overpunishment, we'd like to take an opportunity to ask you about some of your work on free will, especially your book, Free Will and Illusion. You defend two radical proposals in that book, and I'll ask about the first. On your view, there's something right about the view that free will is compatible with determinism, but there's also something right about the view, sometimes called hard determinism, that determinism is true and it rules out free will. What do you mean when you say that there's something right about both of these proposals?
Okay. So, I mean, since there's just 100% of the truth, so they can't be both completely right. So basically, let's assume there's either because of determinism or because indeterminism doesn't help, or let's assume there's no libertarian free will. So we're something like in either a determined world or in a world which there is quantum mechanics and determinism, whatever, but it doesn't really matter. So the question is basically what's familiarly known as the compatibility question. Is this situation, in short, let's call it determinism, is it compatible with free will and moral responsibility? And people have intuitively, almost universally have either yes or no. I mean, either they're compatibilist or they're incompatibilist, like hard determinists or denialists, if they don't think there's libertarian free will. And I just kind of realized, I think this is sort of a discovery. I mean, it was quite early. I mean, it's not an either or question. You can have complex, and I think gradually the debate and illusionism, the second part, the second big thing that I want to say on free will, I think hardly anybody agrees with me on illusionism. But on the ability dualism, people are starting to gain this view, and you hear more and more people being some form of pluralists on the compatibility question. Now, the idea here is that partly it's contextual. So it's in some contexts, it just matters. The compatibilist forms of free will just matter. I mean, and nothing else really matters. It's not clear anything else. For example, if you're having lunch and you're debating between yourself, do you want to eat spaghetti or schnitzel or whatever? And all you do want a sense of freedom. For example, if somebody is compelled to eat schnitzel because, even if they tell you don't eat the schnitzel today, it's not good, you'll make you ill, and you still fail to ill, then you're not free. I mean, you want
Hmm.
what John Martin Fisher's and others have called reason responsiveness, uh, as a form of explicating compatibilism. So it really matters that you have compatible system. But why would you want libertarian free will in that context? What else do you want to have except, you want to eat what you want to eat? So in those contexts. Also, more importantly, I think in paradigm examples, compatibilism is clearly very salient. For example, if a woman has a compulsion to wash her hands 50 times an hour, then this is really ruining her life. She's not free. She's not free to do anything else because of this compulsion. Let's assume that determinism rules everything. So everything about her is determined, and then she goes and seeks treatment, and let's say psychotherapy, whatever, and that's also determined. So determined, it's determined she'll do it. The treatment is deterministic,
Right.
but it works. And now she just washes her hands when it's proper to do it and makes sense to do that. So she's been released, and you can see how important it is also because people are willing to pay a lot of money to go for that sort of treatment, not because it's not deterministic, but let's assume it is deterministic, but because it cures them of a sense of a sort of very important sort of unfreedom which exists even in a deterministic world. So the people who have this compulsion are not free, and the determined people who have this compulsion are free in a very, very important sense. So compatibilism wins, like, a lot of situations. On the other hand, you have situations where if somebody ends up somebody who's completely free according to compatibilist lights, he ends up 20 years serving 20 years in sentence in prison, and his life is practically ruined. Then the fact that ultimately he could not have formed himself to be anything else, that his character was given, his belief, his desires, etc., led him to do this. This is really matters. It makes sense. The
Yeah.
description, an important description of that, is that he is a victim of circumstances, even though the circumstances are internalized, etc. So it matters. Sometimes it matters. Sometimes it just matters. One of those sides matters: the compatibilist side or the ultimate hard determinist or the nihilist side. And sometimes both matter, and we have to think. So that's why we need to be more nuanced and complex in the way we treat the compatibility questions. Right? Yeah.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, you mentioned so there's the dualism about the compatibility issue, but then the other proposal is your illusionism. So I want to ask about illusion in particular. Your view is that it's sort of morally necessary for us to maintain the illusion that we have free will. Could you explain why you think the illusion of free will is morally necessary?
Okay. Now, again, I think things are complex. I mean, we have, even in philosophy, we have really strong, this is like a meta philosophical point. We have strong
Hmm.
inclinations to go for simplistic answers. So either compatibilism is true or, hard determinism and denialism are true. So no, you have to say, I think the correct answer is, well, it depends. Sometimes neither might, sometimes either might be, sometimes both. Again, here, I think illusion comes in various ways. One of the ways illusion comes in is as sort of because of the psychological weakness of compatibilism. I mean, people who've thought free will, it's notoriously known among people who teach free will that it's really hard to get our students to recognize compatibilism. I mean, once they start putting in doubt, if they start believing in determinism, they put in doubt, they're starting putting like their libertarian assumptions, which usually people have when they come into the class, then they tend to go all the way. And then what it means, I mean, it might lead to utilitarianism, it might lead to like a consequentialist thinking about all these punishment or anything, or it might lead to nihilism, or it might, just whatever it leads to. But it's very hard for people to see the partial, what I would claim is the partial truth, the limited, but nevertheless, very important truth of compatibilism. And why does that truth matters? It matters because of things which we'll get in, which will be relevant once we get into punishment.
Hmm.
It's really important that people take moral innocence seriously. And
Right.
think that it's really bad if somebody who has done nothing, who is innocent, is punished. But if you think that, well, there's no free will, everybody's just determined, and if you look at all this simplistically, which people are inclined to do, if they lose belief in libertarian free will, then, well, everybody's innocent, and what does it really matter? And let's just kind of manage things, manage it in a social way, in an effective way, and not care about who's innocent and who's innocent. So there's danger. There's all these dangers, and similarly on the personal psychological level. So one answer is that compatibilism goes a certain way. It's really important that people take it seriously. It's important that we maintain what I call in my book the community of responsibility, which is that most people, most of the time, have free will and are morally responsible. And it's crucial in order to respect persons, to treat persons with due respect, that we have this assumption. But there's a great risk that if we lose belief in libertarian free will, we'll go overboard and just we won't stop. We'll go all the way down. And that's really dangerous. Secondly, I think beyond that, and maybe in a deeper way, I think the truth is just really dangerous here. I mean, it sounds a bit like Nietzsche, but he has these sometimes
Mhm.
about these things, but the dangerous truth. But I think in the free will case that is the case, because if we start thinking deeply, internalize, not just as a philosophical thought, but internalizing the idea that we and everything we do and all the people we appreciate and even love, and or let's say moral heroes, people who have, we rate to value. If you just start to think about it and say, well, everybody is who he is, or who he or she is, because of factors beyond their control. So everybody's just it's less what I call the unfolding of the given, just an unfolding of something that just happens to be the case.
Right.
Then what does it really matter? And then moral seriousness and self-respect and the appreciation of others. I mean, it doesn't matter how much somebody has sacrificed, how much devoted he's been or she's been, and how much efforts and risks they've taken and all that. If you just look at them and say, they're part of, it's just part of nature. It's just part of, that's how things are. Sometimes it rains and sometimes it doesn't rain. But if you start looking at human beings like that, that's a major danger to respect for persons, to the appreciation of somebody can spend all his life making huge efforts for the sake of others and sacrifices, etc. But then you start looking at
Right.
it, well, you're not really better than anybody else, because I mean that's a huge disrespect and hugely, I think, unfair. And just because that the person has aimed all his life to be a very good person, to do all these efforts, and then you just say, no, everybody's the same. In
Yeah.
that it doesn't matter what you've done. It doesn't respect agency. It doesn't respect effort. It doesn't respect all those things. So that's the sort of. I mean, of course, it's a long story. It's a long book. Maybe
Right.
today I would
Right.
write differently, maybe, but that's the sort of rationale here. So practically, it's practical, because in a way we can't trust ourselves with the truth, and partly it's that the truth is so awful. That's, if I want to summarize it in the like in a slogan, the way
Hmm.
that's
Yeah.
what I would want to say.
Yeah.
That makes sense.
So,
Thanks. Yeah. Thanks for letting us ask about that too.
yeah, I have, if I may, I have a follow-up question. Um, Philosophers like Dirk Pereboom and Greg Caruso
Mhm.
don't think that we have the control necessary to basically deserve anything,
Yeah.
but they're more hopeful. So, what would you say to philosophers like that who want to accept the truth, what you call the horrible truth, and say, well, it's actually not that bad. We can be hopeful about this and rearrange society in a way that is actually better.
Right. Well, I mean, these, of course, are big issues, and a lot of a lot of smart people on all sides of the debate. So, and it's important that so it's not this, and there's rarely in philosophy knockdown arguments. So it's not like I
Yeah.
don't have one. So, but I think that I think well. I have, I mean, I have a lot of arguments, and I've written maybe too many papers on all these stuff, and the debate is really, it's a very important and lively debate currently, because suddenly in the last generation, it used to be that there are hardly any hard determinants, but suddenly it's
Mhm.
become there's a stronger group with good philosophers, etc.
Right.
But I mean, just to give an indication of the sort of thing that I have in mind, I just think that we tend to be too optimistic and tend to be too complacent. I have like an older paper once about in general in the free will debate. So everybody seems to be too optimistic. Everybody for each person, each position for different reasons, either because physically we have free will or it doesn't
Mm,
matter, etc., etc. We just tend to have to be too optimistic. And in general, I tend to be an optimistic person, but I think the psychology here is defeating to us. So we tend to, in this case, free will is a really problematic issue, um,
mm,
and I think that in order to see why there would be dangers, one way is to think about the idea that it really matters whether, and this connects to a big topic of overpunishment, of course. We need to assume some sort of free will, at least compatibilist, for all this to make sense. But and the analysts would want to reject this, of course. But I think that when we look back, the idea that it matters greatly whether somebody was innocent or not, morally innocent or not, is a huge achievement. It's one of the two or three greatest achievements of humanity. And you can see, I mean, you can see already in the Bible when they say there's a complaint against God. I mean,
Mhm.
people have eaten sour grapes and their teeth, their children's teeth are on edge. I mean, how come? Why would I be punished for the sins of my father or mother? And that scene, well, that must be unjust. But that's a huge achievement because certainly historically, but even today in many cultures, it's not people. You have collective punishment, or people don't then
Mhm.
mhm,
just try to manage things as efficiently as they think they can, and don't care very much about innocence or not innocence. So that's it's. I think it's a huge achievement, and we know, and it's complacent to think that well everything will be fine because I mean history has taught us that it won't be fine. It's really crucial that we take seriously this sort of distinction. That's just one example,
mhm.
and we won't take it seriously if we don't believe in that there is a robust sense of free will. And
Yeah.
again, even although I think compatibilism, it's important. There is a case, a partial case for, partly a case for compatibilism. There's a risk that people won't take that seriously. So that's like one reply. A second is more again on the psychological side. So I think that again that different people have different temperaments, and in general, I believe that philosophy is to it has a large psychological element there, so that we have to work on ourselves in order to resist the truth, in order to see other sides, because we tend to be one-sided. I mean, there's a lot of psychology going on in trying to be a good philosopher, I think, and I
Mhm.
think that so that also there are different people. So there might be some
Mm,
people. I'm not saying that nobody can live with the truth, maybe,
mm,
but I think that I think it's interesting that to reflect that the deeper one is, the more somebody takes seriously moral issues, the more somebody takes seriously philosophy in general and skepticism and what can happen. I think the greater the risks are. So if you don't care a lot, I mean, all you care about is drinking beers and watching football, which is
mhm.
good, but that's cool. Then you don't won't worry too much. But if you're taking seriously these issues, then,
Right.
for example, and then you just reflect what it means. I mean, it means that again, it means that people who have the people who we value most, who we respect the most, either people close to us who've done all they can and made great efforts on our behalf, or people throughout history. I mean, the great, I don't know, Nelson Mandela, people like that. And if you start looking at them and just saying, well, that's the way it was, and then the whole idea that we sort of accumulate value throughout our lives on the basis of our actions, and therefore we deserve the respect of others, and we can respect ourselves, increase our own self-respect because we could have done otherwise, but we decided to not to go to the easy path, but to take the difficult path, but the more respectful path, or important path, or demanding path, or riskful,
Mhm.
etc. I mean, if you look back, I mean, if a denialist make this personal, just right. I mean, if a denialist look back, he will say, well, that's the way I was built. That's it. I mean, you tend to, in a way, your value tends to disappear. So I think it's really risky psychologically to, in terms of our, but not just psychologically, just in terms of, oh, okay, you should, take some medication or something, but in the deep sense of, who we are and how we see life. It's really risky to look at the truth. I mean, if the truth is that there's no free will, and
Right.
and therefore, I think I think the denialists are far too optimistic. They tend to look.
Yeah.
They focus on the area of, like, naturally. I mean, they focus on the areas where, like, the evils of punishment, etc., and in certain circumstances. But the wider the picture is much wider, and the dangers are much deeper and much broader, I would want to say.
Hmm.
Yeah. All right. Well, let's shift now from your views on free will to the issue of overpunishment. Your recent paper, Overpunishment and the Punishment of the Innocent. In this paper, you compare punishing an innocent person with overpunishing someone who is guilty. Could you give us some examples to help make the difference between these two clear?
Okay, I mean, just the basic idea is that somebody who's innocent has done, in this case here, and we are assuming in general. I mean, we're assuming it's a law-abiding citizen, not just somebody who, in this particular case, happens to be innocent. But let's assume
Hmm.
somebody who is in general innocent in terms of any serious criminal activity.
Hmm.
Now, the idea is that the person actually deserves zero punishment because he or she has done nothing, but he or she gets 8 years in prison. And then the other instance is where somebody, let's assume he deserves 8 years in prison, but then he gets 16 years in prison. And we need to calibrate a little bit. We need to adjust. I mean, it might be that psychological years in prison might matter more, but we can avoid all these issues. Let's assume that things are exact, and also, let's assume that you get 8 years in prison, you spend them, not that you're in prison. Not We don't want to think about all the complexities of it's a thought experiment, so we don't
Hmm.
want to think about you'll get released before when you'll get parole or whatever. So
Right.
basically,
Yeah.
it's the question is, and that's a question I like because I like more paradoxes. We'll talk about this later, maybe. Is that I mean, it seems like, well, 8 is 8. If you deserve zero and you get 8, then that's an injustice to the size of 8 years. And while at the same time, if you deserve 8 years and you get 16 years, then again, it's the same sort of injustice. So, am I saying that 8 isn't equal to 8? Just to put it the
Right.
picturesque way. And my answer is no. That 8 isn't equal to 8. That it is a big deal. That it matters much. It matters. It's very important. I mean, clearly, punishment matters greatly because we're putting people beyond bars and denying their freedom, and prisons tend to be terrible places. So it really matters. Over punishment matters, and the over here matters. So it's beyond desert, but it shouldn't. It doesn't matter the same as in the case of the punishment of the innocent, and we shouldn't worry as much. We should worry and we should be concerned, but we shouldn't worry as much as or to put it differently, today we worry very much about the punishment of the innocent. We worry much less about overpunishment. I'm not saying maybe we should also worry more about overpunishment, but the difference still makes sense. Punishment of the innocent is a much greater moral worry than overpunishment.
Yeah, my next question was going to be on that. So you might see punishment of the innocent and then over punishment as just two different forms of injustice, specifically of harming people kind of beyond what's deserved. But do you think people tend to see these as sort of equally morally bad? Or I mean, it seems like you want to say punishment of the innocent is somehow more morally bad than over punishment. Is that how people tend to think about these things? Or do you think people tend to think, no, over punishment's definitely not as morally bad?
Well, I mean, in a way, it's not. It's like a philosophical question. I'm not an expert. I mean, it's not. You have to do
Yeah,
survey
sure.
and whatever. But I mean, people who really know something about life. But I'm just a philosopher. But I mean, I think it's clear that these civilized societies take very seriously punishment of the innocent, and there's a great effort
Hmm.
not to avoid it. Uh, on the other hand, I mean, if you look at the United States, there are supposed to be over 2 million people in prisons, and there are good reasons to think that there's a lot of overpunishment going on, and it's not clear that people take it that seriously. So I think there is psychologically, sociologically, clearly there is a difference here in the way how seriously people take it. Now,
Yeah.
one possible explanation is cynical. And the other one that punishment of the innocent is something that's worrisome to everybody because everyone, whatever your social class or social position or economic situation or whoever you happen to be, you might be framed by the police always, or you might happen. We've read all these detective stories. It just might happen that it would seem like you've done something and you wouldn't be able to prove otherwise, etc. So in a sense, we want
Right.
everybody's concerned about punishing the innocent because if because then even if you're innocent, you might end up in prison. That's terrible. On the other hand, I think cynically, most people are less worried about over punishment because they're not candidates for punishment in the first place. So in that way, we're not. We most no, nobody people are not really worried about committing. So we're not going to rape people or kill people, etc. So or even
Yeah.
engage, rob banks or whatever. So we won't end up in prison, as far as we know, in a deserved way. We'll never deserve a prison sentence. So we're not really worried about overpunishment. On the other hand, if you want to go completely cynical, it's actually good that people who are in prison, who deservedly are in prison, maybe if they get more time in prison, they'll spend it. There'll be less time outside and endanger us and our families less. So there's a cynical argument why we care much more about punishment of the innocent as compared to overpunishment.
Hmm.
But my question was, I mean, is there a moral case as well? I mean, is this just
Right.
cynical, or is there a case for? And I think there is a good case for. I mean, again, overpunishment is bad. We should avoid it. We should prevent it. And we should, as a society, we should be worried about it, particularly as it's done in our name, but and humanly also, but it's not as nearly as bad as punishment of the innocent, though at least that's my claim.
Hmm.
Yeah. You've argued that there are several reasons for thinking that overpunishment should be less worrying than punishment of the innocent. Could you talk through some of those reasons?
Sure, I mean, in the article I have quite many reasons. We won't go through all of them, but just to give an indication, I think one I think is one I think that really matters greatly is I think is the importance of agency. This connects to our first topic,
Hmm.
and responsibility, and personal responsibility, and agency. So I think that I mean, people who commit crime, serious crime. We're talking about serious, not misdemeanors. We're talking about serious crimes. Are taking a risk. It's a gamble. I mean, they're risking. They'll gain a lot, or they believe they'll gain a lot. But if they get caught, then they lose, and they're hoping that they won't. So they're taking on risk. While people who have done nothing, who are innocent that we're talking about, have done nothing, and that really matters greatly. I'll give an example. I mean, if you let's say there are two people, and these two people get shot by an over neurotic bank security person. I mean, the bank guard overreacts to a bank robbery and starts shooting, and two people get hurt. I mean, if one person who gets hurt is a woman who went into the bank to cash a check. Okay, that's perfectly normative. She took on no risk. There's no. It's just terrible. You go into the bank, cash a check, perfectly sensible thing to do, normal thing to do, and then you get shot by this guard. And on the other hand, if the other person who got shot, and let's say in the same way, is the robber. I mean, the guy came with a gun and starts robbing the bank. Now, again, he doesn't. Let's assume that the guard overreacted and that he shouldn't have started shooting. and that nobody deserves to be shot in this situation. Let's assume, and that the bank robber also certainly didn't deserve to be shot
Hmm.
in the way he was. But it's completely different than the women who came in to cash the check, because if you're going to rob banks, you're taking on a risk that some overreacting prison guard, bank guards security guards will overreact and shoot you, and it's part of in a way it's part of the risk you're taking. So that's I think one of the reasons that I think it matters greatly that even if you so the overpunishment is in biology is you get more than you deserve, but you're already on the wrong side. I mean,
Hmm.
your agency, your free agency, we're assuming, culpably, you've done something. You shouldn't go and rob banks, so you shouldn't commit crimes which you end up getting 8 years for. So if you get more, that's like the trigger happy security guard in the bank. It's not like
Hmm.
when you're a bank robber, and that's a completely different case than if you've done nothing. The innocent person is like the woman who just came in to cash a check.
Hmm.
So that's one reason. I think this connects to. I've done some work on moral complaint and the possibility of moral complaint and on moral standing. This is one of the paradoxes in my book, second book, 10 Moral Paradoxes, is about paradox of moral complaint. So we won't go into that,
Hmm.
but I think it's important. I emphasize there the importance of thinking about moral complaint. And again, here, the if you're a criminal, you're a criminal, you deserve 8 years in prison. We're assuming this is an assumption of the debate. Then you've crossed the moral line, also the legal line, but you've crossed the moral line. You've crossed the crucial line. And therefore, if you get overpunished, it's not the same as somebody who hasn't crossed the line, who hasn't done anything, who's completely innocent and completely. In a sense, if you end up with serving 8 years, deservedly serving 8 years in prison, then yes, you can complain why you got more than you deserve. But
Hmm.
in a sense, you've crossed the line, and you're standing as complaining about why am I being wronged? Well, but who are you to complain? I mean, you've wronged people. You've whatever the crime that you've committed, you agree. Let's assume you agree that you deserve to be 8 years in prison. You're just complaining about the extra years, and yeah, maybe you have a case, but you have less of a moral standing to complain that if you've done nothing. Because if you've done nothing, you deserve nothing. You haven't crossed any moral line, and you're completely kosher. I mean, there's no
Yeah.
issue. So that's
Yeah.
like another way to think. So partly, just I'll give if this time I'll just give two.
Yeah.
Well,
Sure.
another reason we can be less worried about this is because the stigma issue doesn't come up so seriously.
Hmm.
I mean, it's better to it's worse to be if it's known that you're serving 16 years, it's a more serious crime than 8 years. Okay, there's partly it's more, but the most important thing is being in prison. So if there's an innocent person and then she ends up in prison, that's a huge. I mean, that's just for her and for all her and family and her environment. It's a huge change in terms of. I mean, she has a criminal stigma. Well, if somebody is already in prison, being a little more, of course, it matters to be, and if it's unjust, then it matters. But it doesn't raise up a new issue of stigma. That's one. And then one fun. I mean, I have a few more
Yeah. Right. Yeah.
arguments, but just one quick one, which I think I worry about. I think it's problematic, but I think it's also important. Um, we have normally it's fairly safe to assume that the person who's being overpunished, let's assume the person who's 8 years serving 8 years in our example, 8 years in prison, but then gets an additional. I mean, he's serving 16 while he deserves only 8. It's fairly safe to assume that it's not his first crime. I mean, hardly any, most burglaries are not done by first time offenders, etc. I mean, most people who if you're a burglar, you do repeatedly, etc. And similarly with most other crimes. And
Hmm.
therefore, it's safe to say, I mean, as a society, in terms of general policy, we can assume that the person who is now being overpunished actually committed numerous previous offenses of a similar nature and was simply not caught. So still, this doesn't mean that, I mean, he should still be punished only for 8 years if that's what he deserves for this crime. But in terms of how much we should be worried about it, in some sense, he's paying for all the crimes that he wasn't caught while he committed. While if we're assuming that the person who is completely innocent, who has never done any criminal thing, never crossed any seriously moral line, or at least legal line, we're assuming that that person is hasn't. I mean, obviously hasn't. That he doesn't have that overdraft, if you could call it that way, that
Yeah.
all these crimes he committed and wasn't caught. So okay, now he is paying for it, but he has nothing to pay for. So that's another reason why we should, as a society, we can be less. We should still be worried. Again, we should take these things seriously. We should take justice seriously and punishment seriously. And over punishment is a case of injustice, and we should take it very seriously. Again, but as compared to the punishment of the innocent, which we do tend to put on a pedestal much higher, I think we should continue to do that. It is a much worse thing. Morally and socially. And so it's not just
Mhm.
cynicism. There are good reasons why we should continue to take punishment of the innocents much more seriously than over punishment.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, thanks for talking through so many of those reasons. Near the end of the paper, you give a thought experiment that I found helpful for thinking through this for myself. So you imagine a case in which, for some reason, um, we have to choose some person to be undeservedly imprisoned for 8 years. And so we have two people, one chosen at random off the street, and the other a convicted criminal who's near the end of an 8-year sentence. So we're kind of building on the thought experiment already been talking about. And then you ask, given that other considerations are equal in the sense that both are the same age, there are no dependents and so forth, whom should we choose for the punishment? Um, I think I know how you're going to answer that question, but can you explain your answer and how you think it bears on the question of which is morally worse, over punishment or punishment of the innocent?
Right. Well, I mean, again, like all these philosophical experiments, it has its strengths and its faults. So
Mm-hmm.
you might want to water down and just say, well, we know that somebody has been punished for is going to be punished for 8 years unjustly, and we hope that, and we don't know, we can't affect it. And do we hope that it's the criminal, or do we hope that it's the completely innocent person? But we could also see the idea of, okay, we are the ones who are going to choose this and how to think about it. So of course it matters,
Mm-hmm.
thought experience. But I think in all these cases, I think that we would be inclined to say that, no, the person that in certain, I mean, and that is how we think about it. Let's say we are assuming that we can save one person. And who are we going to save? I mean, because somebody needs to be punished, and we can only save one out of the two. One of them is the person who is just finished. He's paid his dues to society, and he's about to be released. And the other person is completely innocent. I think that what we should, I mean, this is against holding other things equal, and often, as we
Mm-hmm.
know, things are not equal, and people end up in prison
Right.
if they've been victimized, and there are various complications. But just in the pure thought experiment sense, I mean, I think that the person who for the same reasons I've given, I mean, the person who's crossed the moral line, who has taken the risk of committing crimes, and we're assuming he admits that he committed crime freely, and he took the risk, he gambled, and he failed, and that's why he ended up 8 years in prison. If you engage in criminal activity, which means you harm other people, I mean, we can, depending, of course, what crime it is, but let's not think about just white collar crime. Not that white collar crime doesn't harm other people as well, but let's speak about serious, harmful, violent crimes. In those situations, yes, you've paid your dues, but you've taken on this risk and taking on a gamble. You've crossed the moral line. You've harmed other innocent people. We're assuming, and therefore, if you're overpunished, then yeah, it's bad. But somebody has to pay the price, and your moral standing is lesser than the person who is throughout her life has done no wrong, has made every effort not to cross the moral lines or the legal lines,
Hmm.
and is just has always been a good person. If somebody has to be sacrificed, somebody has to pay the price, somebody has to be saved in terms of the thought experiment, then she has to be saved, and you are so we're sorry. I mean, it's of course a
Right.
regretful situation, but your moral standing is lesser because again, you've crossed the moral line, etc. You have less going to complain. All the reasons I gave before.
Hmm. All right.
Okay.
Well, thank you so much for talking about that article and your earlier work, Free Will and Illusion. It's been a great conversation. If listeners are interested in reading more of your work, where can they go to follow you?
Okay. Well, the books I've just written 2 books. I'm now working on a third book, but that'll take a while. In
Uh-huh.
general, my on free will, there's free will and illusion. I think my most updated position and I think easier to approach is there's the Oxford Handbook, edited by Perbam and Nelkin, just came out last year. The Oxford Handbook on Moral Responsibility, and I have a
Hmm.
chapter on illusionism on my position. So that's I haven't changed
Cool. Yeah.
my opinion since then. So that's probably the officially, I mean, the philosophy in terms of philosophy. My my book, 10 Moral Paradoxes, I think, accessible. I mean, it's sort of, it's both philosophy and articles that came out in analysis and places like that, but there's also,
Hmm.
short pieces and without too many footnotes even, and it's really accessible. Anybody, high school graduates could read that, I guess. And so that, and it's a short book as well. And there's just a lot of articles, and I have this. Just look me up. I mean, there's my site, www. Saul Smilansky, and you can look it up, and there are links to me. I think most of my papers there, and if people want to engage in writing about this, they can just email me, and I'll be glad to respond. So
Yeah,
yeah,
very cool.
thank you for the attention
Nice.
to my
Yeah,
work.
you're welcome. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah.
Sure, it's a pleasure. Thank you very much. Okay.
Mhm.
In our next episode, we'll talk about children in the law, and our guest will be Gideon Yaffe, Wesley Newcomb Hofield Professor of Jurisprudence, Professor of Philosophy, and Professor of Psychology at Yale University.